The evening sky was turning a deep purple as she drove home from another exhausting 12-hour shift at Metro General Hospital. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. Working in the emergency room was never easy, but tonight had been particularly challenging. 3 car accidents and a busy waiting room had kept her on her feet all day. She checked her watch, 8:45 p.m. All she could think about was getting home, taking a hot shower, and catching up on her favorite TV show. Maybe she'd even treat herself to that leftover pizza in the fridge. That's when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. In 15 years of driving, she'd never been pulled over. She knew the drill though: find a well-lit area, signal, pull over safely, and keep your hands where they can be seen. She chose to stop under a bright street lamp near a 24-hour convenience store. Better to be safe, she thought. The police cruiser parked behind her, its lights still flashing, painting the inside of her car in alternating red and blue. She could see the officer's silhouette in her mirror as he stepped out of his vehicle. Her hands stayed firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just like her father had taught her years ago. Time seemed to slow down as she watched the officer approach in her side mirror. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate. Something about his walk seemed off, too aggressive, too rushed. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat about a broken taillight. The knock on her window made her jump, despite expecting it. The officer's flashlight beam was unnecessarily bright, shining directly into her eyes. She squinted, trying to maintain her composure while lowering the window. License and registration. The command came sharp and fast, without even a greeting. His voice carried an edge that made her stomach tighten. "Good evening, officer," she responded politely, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anxiety. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" That's when everything changed. The officer's demeanor shifted from aggressive to hostile. His hand tensed on his flashlight, knuckles whitening. "I said, license and registration." She nodded slowly, speaking clearly and calmly. "I understand, sir. I'm going to reach for my purse to get my license. It's in the passenger seat." She narrated her movements, just as she'd learned to do with agitated patients in the ER. Stay calm, stay professional, keep everyone informed. But as she began to move her right hand from the steering wheel, it happened. The officer suddenly lunged forward, reaching through the window. His hand struck her face with shocking force, snapping her head to the side. The sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed in the quiet car. Time froze. The red and blue lights kept flashing, creating a surreal backdrop to this moment of unexpected violence. Her cheek stung, and she could taste metal in her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. In that crucial moment, as the shock waves of what just happened rippled through her body, she had a choice to make. Years of handling crisis situations in the ER had taught her that the next few seconds would determine everything. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, the natural urge to respond with equal force and fury. But something deeper kicked in, the same instinct that had helped her talk down countless aggressive patients, that had guided her through the most challenging moments in her career. It wasn't just about her anymore. This moment could either escalate into something tragic or transform into something meaningful. She turned her head slowly back to face the officer, feeling the warmth of tears in her eyes but refusing to let them fall. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about breaking a cycle that had claimed too many lives, destroyed too many families, and torn apart too many communities. The officer's flashlight beam wavered slightly. Perhaps he was already realizing what he'd done, or maybe he was preparing for what he expected would come next: screaming, accusations, a scene that would end badly for everyone involved. But that's not what he was about to get. Not tonight, not from her. The next few moments unfolded like a scene from a movie, but this was painfully real. Her cheek throbbed where the officer had struck her, and the taste of copper lingered in her mouth. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across her dashboard, creating shadows that seemed to pulse with her racing heartbeat. She could hear the officer's heavy breathing outside her window. His flashlight beam trembled slightly now, creating shifting patterns on her steering wheel. The night air flowing through her open window felt cold against her skin, carrying with it the faint smell of exhaust fumes and the sweetness of nearby flowering trees. "Step out of the vehicle." The officer's voice cracked slightly, betraying an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? Anger? Regret? After 12 years in the ER, she'd become good at reading people, especially in crisis situations. Something in his tone told her this man was struggling with his own demons. Her hands hadn't moved from the steering wheel. They were steady despite everything. Years of performing under pressure had taught her how to keep her body calm, even when her mind was racing. She thought about her patients, how the most critical moments often required the most gentle touch. "Officer," she spoke softly but clearly, her voice carrying the same tone she used with frightened patients. "I want you to know that I'm still going to reach for my license and registration. I'm not making any sudden moves. We can handle this professionally." The officer shifted his weight, his utility belt jingling slightly. She could see his free hand hovering near his weapon. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one harsh word, and things could spiral even further out of control. Through her side mirror, she noticed a car slowing down as it passed. A potential witness. The convenience store's security camera was probably recording too. But she wasn't thinking about evidence or lawsuits. Her mind was on something her grandmother used to say. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who knows when not to fight. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the soft idling of both vehicles. Her cheek was beginning to swell, and she could feel a headache building behind her eyes. But these physical discomforts seemed far away, less important than the crucial moments unfolding around her. She thought about her morning rounds at the hospital, about the young man who'd come in with a gunshot wound. Another incident that had started with a simple misunderstanding and escalated too quickly. She'd watched his mother cry in the waiting room, wondering how many more families would be torn apart by moments like these. The officer's radio crackled to life, making them both jump slightly. A dispatcher's voice, tinny and distant, called out codes she didn't understand. The officer didn't respond to it, seemingly frozen in this moment with her. His flashlight beam had lowered slightly, no longer blinding her. She could see him more clearly now. His stance had changed. The initial aggression was giving way to something else. His shoulders had dropped slightly, and his breathing had slowed. She recognized these signs from her work, the moment when adrenaline begins to fade and reality starts to sink in. Taking a slow, deep breath, she prepared herself for what would come next. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even just about this officer. It was about breaking a cycle that had played out too many times on too many streets in too many cities. The bruise forming on her face would heal, but the real wounds, the ones that ran deep through their community, those needed more than just time. They needed someone to make a different choice, to show that there was another way forward. As she prepared to speak again, she thought about all the times she'd seen violence answered with violence, anger met with anger, fear feeding fear. But she also thought about the times she'd seen miracles in her ER, moments when humanity shone through the darkness, when compassion broke through barriers that seemed unbreakable. The next words she would speak would either build a bridge or burn one. And despite everything that had just happened, she knew exactly which choice she needed to make. She turned to face the officer fully, letting him see the impact of what he'd done. The bruise was forming on her cheek, visible even in the dim mix of street light and cruiser spots. But it wasn't anger in her eyes, it was something else entirely, something that would change both their lives forever. "I forgive you," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear in the night air. "And I want you to know that I see you too. I see someone who's probably dealt with more stress and trauma than most people could handle. I see someone who made a mistake tonight, but that mistake doesn't have to define who you are." The officer's flashlight dropped slightly, its beam now pointing at the ground. In its reflected light, she could see his face clearly for the first time. The confusion, the shame, the surprise all mixing together. He clearly hadn't expected this response. Nobody ever did. "I'm an ER nurse," she continued, her voice taking on the gentle but firm tone she used with patients in crisis. "Every day, I see what happens when moments like this go wrong. I've treated the victims, comforted the families, watched the cycle of violence spin on and on. But right now, we have a chance to break that cycle." A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them both. The convenience store's neon signs hummed in the background, casting their own colorful glow into the night. She could see the officer's hand trembling slightly as he finally lowered the flashlight completely. I could react with anger, she said, touching her swollen cheek gently. I could scream or threaten to sue or call the media. And maybe I'd be justified in doing any of those things. But what would that solve? Would it help you become a better officer? Would it make our community any safer? The weight of her words hung in the air between them. She could see him struggling with them, wrestling with his training, his pride, his fear. His radio crackled again, but he still didn't reach for it. This moment felt too important to interrupt. Every day in the ER, I have to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death, she continued, her voice softening. I've made mistakes too, we all have. The real measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's what they do after they make them. She reached slowly for her purse, telegraphing her movements clearly. This time, the officer didn't react. He stood perfectly still, watching as she pulled out her hospital ID badge. The photo showed her in scrubs, smiling, ready to help anyone who needed it. She held it up where he could see it. 12 years in the emergency room, she said, letting him read the badge. I've seen gunshot wounds, stabbings, assault victims, all because someone chose violence over understanding. I've watched police officers bring in injured suspects, and I've treated officers who were hurt in the line of duty. Every single time, I thought about how many of those injuries could have been prevented if someone had just chosen a different path. The silence that followed was different now. The tension had shifted into something else, something that felt like the moment in the ER when a critical patient's vitals finally stabilize, when you know you've turned a corner toward healing. My shift just ended, she said, still holding her badge. I spent 12 hours helping people who were having the worst day of their lives. Now I'm sitting here, having what could be the worst moment of my day, or, she paused, making sure her next words carried their full weight. It could be the moment when both of us choose to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. She could see tears forming in the officer's eyes now. His tough exterior had cracked, revealing the human being beneath the badge. The same human being she'd known was there all along, who just needed someone to remind him of his own humanity. So what do you say? She asked, finally lowering her badge. Should we show the world that there's a better way to handle moments like these? Because I'm willing to work with you, not against you. I'm willing to turn this into something positive, something that could help other officers and other civilians avoid situations like this. But that choice has to start with you. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman who'd been struck, and he wasn't just an officer who'd struck her. They were two human beings standing at a crossroads, with the power to choose which path they take next. The officer's hand dropped to his side, his flashlight pointing at the ground. For a moment, the only movement came from the swirling lights of his cruiser, still painting the scene in alternating red and blue. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, the words catching in his throat. "I'm so sorry." He took off his hat, holding it against his chest like a shield. In that gesture, she could see the walls coming down, the uniform giving way to the person underneath. 15 years on the force, he continued, his voice growing steadier but staying soft. I've never done anything like this before. I don't even know why He trailed off, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. She watched as he struggled to find his next words. Through the window of the convenience store, she could see the clerk watching them, probably wondering if he should call someone. The whole scene must have looked strange from the outside, an officer without his hat, standing in his own flashing lights, looking lost. "Today was rough," he said finally. "Lost a partner to retirement. Found out my kid's sick. Wife's worried about bills, but that's no excuse. None of that excuses what I just did." He looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time. "You could end my career right now. You probably should." She shifted in her seat, turning to face him more fully. The bruise on her face was throbbing less now, or maybe she'd just gotten used to it. "Ending your career won't fix anything," she said. "It won't make you a better officer, and it won't help the next person you pull over." A truck rumbled past them, its headlights briefly illuminating both their faces. In that flash of light, she could see the tears on his cheeks, the lines of stress around his eyes, the gray beginning to show at his temples. He wasn't just a uniform anymore. He was a father, a husband, a man carrying his own burdens. "You know what I see in the ER?" she asked, her voice taking on the warm tone she used with worried families. I see people who've hit rock bottom, people who think they've made mistakes they can't come back from. But I also see people who find the strength to change, to learn, to become better than they were yesterday." The officer wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking almost surprised to find tears there. His radio squawked again, but he reached down and turned the volume lower. This conversation felt more important than any call could be right now. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you screaming at me, calling my supervisor, demanding my badge?" His confusion was genuine, written across his face like a child trying to solve a puzzle. She smiled slightly, despite the pain it caused in her cheek. "Because anger is easy," she said. "Revenge is easy. What's hard is choosing to see the person behind the mistake. What's hard is believing that people can change if we give them the chance." He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to carry a heavy load. "What happens now?" he asked, and she could hear the fear in his voice. Fear of consequences, fear of change, fear of facing what he'd done. "Now," she said, reaching for her purse again, "I'm going to give you my card. It has my number at the hospital. Tomorrow, when you're done with your shift, you're going to call me. We're going to talk about setting up a program at the station, something that helps officers deal with stress and trauma before it turns into moments like this." The officer stared at the card she held out, then took it with trembling fingers. "You'd do that?" he asked. "You'd help me after what I did." "I'm going to help you because of what you did," she corrected him. "Because you're standing here now, showing me that you're capable of remorse, capable of change. And that's where healing has to start." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying away some of the tension that had built up around them. In the distance, a siren wailed, someone else having their own crisis, their own worst moment. But here, in this pool of flashing lights, two people had found a way to turn darkness into something brighter. "Thank you," he whispered, and she could hear the weight of everything he wasn't saying in those two words. "Thank you for not hating me. Thank you for seeing me as human. Thank you for showing me another way." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the police station's conference room. Coffee cups and half-eaten donuts scattered across the table told the story of an early meeting that nobody had expected to attend. The chief of police sat at the head of the table, his face a mix of concern and confusion as he looked between his officer and the nurse who sat across from each other. The bruise on her face had darkened overnight, but her voice remained steady as she explained what had happened. She didn't raise her voice or point fingers. Instead, she talked about stress, about trauma, about the weight that first responders carry every day. She talked about how that weight can build up until something breaks. "I'm not here to file charges," she explained, smoothing her hospital scrubs. She'd come straight from her night shift, stopping only to grab fresh coffee for everyone. "I'm here because we have an opportunity to create real change." The officer sat quietly, his badge and gun placed on the table in front of him. A voluntary surrender before the meeting began. His eyes were red from a sleepless night, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of hope, maybe even relief. "Our officers deal with trauma every day," she continued, pulling out some papers from her bag. "So do our nurses, our doctors, our paramedics. We're all first responders, all carrying burdens that most people couldn't imagine. But while the hospital has programs to help us cope, mandatory counseling, support groups, what do our officers have?" The chief leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "We have department therapists," he started, but she gently cut him off. "Whom nobody wants to see because they're afraid it'll make them look weak," she said. "I know. We had the same problem at the hospital until we changed how we approached it. Now, I think it's time for the police department to change too." She spread her papers across the table, statistics, studies, program outlines. She'd spent her entire shift between patients pulling together everything she could find about stress management and trauma support in law enforcement. The officer watched in amazement as she walked them through her ideas. "First," she said, pointing to a document, "we need to normalize asking for help. Make it part of the culture, not something to be ashamed of. Second, we need regular check-ins, not just after critical incidents, but ongoing support that catches problems before they become crises." The morning light grew stronger as they talked, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. Outside, they could hear the usual bustle of the station, phones ringing, officers checking in, the daily rhythm of law enforcement continuing as always. But in this room, something new was taking shape. The officer spoke up for the first time since the meeting began. "I always thought asking for help meant I wasn't cut out for the job," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Thought I had to be tough all the time, handle everything myself. Yesterday showed me how wrong I was." She smiled at him, ignoring the twinge of pain from her bruise. "Strength isn't about never needing help," she said. "It's about knowing when to ask for it. Every day in the ER, I see what happens when people don't get the support they need. I don't want to see any more officers end up in my emergency room, or worse, have to treat someone they've hurt because they couldn't handle their own trauma." The chief was nodding now, making notes on his pad. "What do you need from us?" he asked, and she could hear the genuine interest in his voice. This wasn't just about avoiding a lawsuit or bad publicity anymore. This was about protecting his officers and his community. "I need a commitment," she replied. "A real commitment to change. Not just policies on paper, but actual support for officers who come forward. I need you to lead by example, to show your department that seeking help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness." The officer straightened in his chair. "I'll be the first," he said firmly. "I'll tell my story. Maybe if they see me do it, others will feel like they can too." Outside the conference room, life went on as usual. But inside, something extraordinary was happening. A moment of violence was being transformed into a catalyst for change. A mistake was becoming a mission. The bruise on her face would fade in time, but the impact of this meeting would last much longer. As they wrapped up, making plans for next steps in future meetings, she caught a glimpse of their reflections in the window: a nurse, an officer, and a police chief, all working together to break down walls that had stood for far too long. 3 months passed like pages turning in a book. The community center's meeting room was packed tight. Officers in uniform and plain clothes, medical staff in scrubs, community members in everyday wear. They'd started small, just a handful of people willing to talk about their struggles. Now they could barely find enough chairs. The nurse stood at the front of the room, her bruise long healed, but the memory of that night still clear in her mind. She'd traded her hospital scrubs for casual clothes today, but she still wore her ID badge. A reminder that she moved between both worlds, bridge builder and healer. "When I started my shift that night," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "I never imagined I'd end up here. But sometimes life's worst moments can lead to its best changes." She gestured to the officer sitting in the front row, who nodded encouragingly. He'd become a regular at these meetings, not just attending but leading discussions. The weight that used to bend his shoulders had lifted somewhat. His eyes were clearer, his smile more genuine. Other officers had started calling him the changed man, not as a joke, but with respect. Last week, she continued, an officer pulled over a teenager who was driving erratically. Instead of assuming the worst, he noticed the tears in her eyes, the way her hands shook. Turns out she'd just left her dad in the emergency room after a heart attack. Instead of writing a ticket, the officer escorted her back to the hospital. Heads nodded around the room. The officer in question sat near the back, trying not to draw attention to himself. But everyone knew who he was. He'd shared his story in last week's session, talking about how the new training had helped him read situations differently. "That's what this program is about," she said, walking between the rows of chairs. "It's not just about managing our own stress and trauma. It's about understanding how our experiences affect the way we treat others. It's about breaking cycles of fear and violence before they start." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Someone's radio crackled softly. Most of the officers were on duty, taking their break to be here. From the hospital across the street, they could hear the occasional siren, a reminder of the constant flow of emergencies that brought them all together. "Our emergency room visits involving police incidents have dropped by 30%, she shared, pointing to a chart on the wall. "Complaints against officers are down. But more importantly, look at this." She flipped to another chart showing the number of officers seeking counseling. The line climbed steadily upward. "That's not a sign of weakness," the officer spoke up from his seat. "That's a sign of strength. That's my colleagues choosing to be better, choosing to take care of themselves so they can take care of others." A young rookie raised her hand, speaking hesitantly. Yesterday, I had to draw my weapon, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Suspect had a knife. But I remembered what we learned here about voice control, about finding the person behind the crisis. I talked him down. A month ago, that might have ended differently. The room fell quiet, absorbing her words. They all knew what differently meant. They'd all seen too many situations spiral out of control, too many moments where a single decision changed lives forever. You see, the nurse said softly, this isn't just about avoiding negative headlines or lawsuits. This is about saving lives, the lives of community members and officers alike. This is about remembering that behind every badge, every hospital ID, every driver's license, there's a human being carrying their own struggles. The officer who'd struck her stood up, moving to join her at the front of the room. 3 months ago, I was that human being struggling, he said, his voice steady now where it once would have cracked. I thought I had to handle everything alone. Now I know better. Now we all know better. Someone opened a window, letting in a fresh breeze that rustled papers and stirred the heavy air. Outside, life in the city continued, cars honking, people walking, the endless rhythm of urban life. But in this room, that rhythm had changed. Here, they'd found a new way to move through the world, a new way to handle the weight they all carried. The nurse looked out at the faces before her, tired faces, hopeful faces, determined faces. They weren't just audience members anymore. They were part of something bigger, something that had started with one terrible moment and grown into a movement for change. 2 years had passed since that fateful night. The conference hall of the downtown hotel buzzed with energy as police chiefs, medical directors, and community leaders from across the country filled the seats. On stage, 2 people stood side by side, a nurse and an officer, once divided by a moment of violence, now united by a mission of change. When I struck her that night, the officer began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, I thought I'd reached the end of my career. Instead, I found a new beginning. He looked over at the nurse, who smiled encouragingly. The scar on her cheek had faded to almost nothing, visible only to those who knew to look for it. Our program started in one precinct, she continued, clicking to the next slide in their presentation. Now it's been adopted by 23 police departments across 6 states. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change happens in moments that never make the headlines. The screen behind them showed photos. Officers and medical staff sharing coffee at dawn briefings, community members and police sitting together in training sessions, hands raised in group discussions. Real people, real moments, real change. Last month, the officer shared, a rookie came to me after a rough call. 2 years ago, he would have kept quiet, pushed it down, let it eat at him. Instead, he asked for help. That's what we call a victory. His voice swelled with pride, not for himself, but for how far they'd all come. A video began playing on the screen, body camera footage from various officers. But instead of the tense confrontations people expected, it showed different scenes. An officer helping an elderly man change a tire, another sitting with a lost child until her parents arrived, a third talking calmly to a man in mental crisis. These aren't just feel-good moments, the nurse explained. These are trained responses, the result of officers who've learned to manage their own stress, recognize trauma in others, and choose connection over confrontation. The afternoon light streamed through the hall's high windows, creating halos around the speakers. In the audience, people leaned forward, taking notes, nodding, some wiping away tears. They could see their own departments, their own communities in these stories. The hospital where I work has seen a 60% drop in police-related injuries, she continued. But more importantly, we've seen a change in how officers and medical staff work together. We're not just treating emergencies anymore, we're preventing them. The officer stepped forward again. I carry my badge with different pride now, he said, touching the shield on his chest. It's not just a symbol of authority anymore. It's a reminder of responsibility, to myself, to my fellow officers, and to every person I meet on the street. From the back of the room, a hand raised. How do you measure success? A voice called out. The nurse and officer exchanged glances, sharing a small smile. Sometimes it's in the statistics, she answered. Fewer incidents, fewer injuries, more officers seeking support. But often it's in the stories we don't hear, the confrontations that don't happen, the situations that don't escalate, the lives that don't get torn apart. The officer nodded. Yesterday, I pulled over a young woman. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes. 2 years ago, that fear might have made me defensive, aggressive. Instead, I saw myself in her fear. I remembered that night, remembered what it taught me. We ended up having a real conversation. She left with a warning and a thank you, not a ticket or trauma. As they wrapped up their presentation, the nurse pulled out one last slide. It showed a simple photo of the convenience store where everything had started. The image stirred something in the audience. They all had their own version of that place, that moment, that choice. Change doesn't happen in grand gestures, she concluded. It happens in small moments, in daily choices, in the way we choose to respond when life tests us. Every officer, every medical professional, every community member has these moments. The question is, what will we do with them? The officer stepped up beside her. 2 years ago, I made the wrong choice in one of those moments, he said softly. But thanks to this amazing person beside me, it wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. And now, we're here to help you write new beginnings in your own communities. As applause filled the hall, they stood together at the podium, no longer nurse and officer, victim and aggressor, but partners in a movement that had grown beyond anything they could have imagined on that dark night 2 years ago. Their story had become more than just a tale of forgiveness. It had become a blueprint for change, a testament to the power of choosing hope over hate, understanding over anger, healing over hurt.